Good evening to
Yeah.
you all, and thank you very much for giving up the time to come and hear what is perhaps a slightly different Bible class. Um, Thank you for reading those verses. We've read them recently, and there, right at the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and He put the plants in there and the animals and all the wonderful things that we see around us as a witness to His power. And what a witness it is. It's absolutely incredible wherever we look, and the more we know, the more we realize the power of God. And we've just really just have we have the Bible and we have creation as our witnesses of God's presence. And I've worked with plants for most of my working career, and I'd always wanted to write a children's book about the wonders of plants. And I was asked to a couple of years ago, and it was a real thrill, because to me it was an opportunity to explain some of the wonders of creation to people, whether they believed about it or not. They were having the evidence of God put before them. And I won't bore you with the story, but it was certainly God's hand at work when I met somebody who said, would you like to do this? And of course I went, yeah, I'd love to. And it was fantastic. And Pryden Publishers are really good. They do art and photography books, and to work for them has been like a real privilege. And there's always teamwork. So, as God worked with the Elohim to create the earth, though my name's on the front of the book, there were other people who worked very hard. And on the left-hand side, there is Maya, who was the commissioning editor. And on the right-hand side, there in the middle, is Alice May, who turned all my ramblings into sense. And on the right-hand side is the artist, Lucilla Perini, who I will never meet because she lives in Buenos Aires. But they all deserve recognition. What for? For their creativity. And it's so ironic that they get acknowledged for their creativity. People don't believe in God. One of the most important parts of gardening and the way plants exist is pollen. And here is some pollen, which has been coloured by a Swiss scientist who actually turns these into portraits, into images. I always think it'd be quite nice to have some curtains like that. But it does go to show that the closer you look, the more you see the detail, and that's the creative hand of God, to the point that you can see the shapes of the pollen is consistent, so that plants can be identified from that. It is so consistent, and again, just look at that, and it speaks of God, the great designer. Everything has been designed. I have a pal who's actually a forensic botanist who goes to murder scenes and the like. And he quite often uses pollen as legal evidence, and you can tell whether a body has been moved and buried and all sorts of things from the pollen or the hairs on the plant. And it's all about the minutiae. And the lovely thing about, and you can see it in the garden at the moment, the snowdrops are starting to emerge, daffodils came earlier, they just do it quietly. There's no huffing and puffing. They just do as God commands them. They respond to the change of environment, the time of year. Nobody tells them. It's just the way God made them, and it's absolutely fantastic. And here is some pollen on a geranium, a herbaceous geranium called Geranium phaeum. And the pollen grains there landing on the what's called the stigmatic surface. A little tube grows down to the ovules, and then creates the seed, and that continues the generations. But the wonderful thing is that it all happens without anybody having to tell it what to do. It's there because God made it. And when you think of the number of species of animals and plants in the world and how they all do the correct thing, they all fit together into ecosystems, as we see on green planets and blue planets and the wonders of the earth there. The creative power of God is absolutely extraordinary, and He is to be forever praised for what He has done to prove to us His existence. It's just such a shame that people don't want God and have turned to evolution and other ridiculous theories instead when they see such marvellous things before them. And if you go to Western Australia, and we'll be concentrating quite a lot, funnily enough, on pollination, but Western Australia is a hotspot for all sorts of plants. I'd love to go there. They have lots of orchids. This is the hammerhead orchid, and it's pollinated by the cyanid wasp. So it's pollinator specific. That wasp pollinates that orchid and nothing else. That's its, job. So what actually happens is that the female of this species actually spends most of its life underground, but during the mating season, it climbs to the top of a stem of grass. And the male will come along, it will catch the female between it in its legs, sort of wrap them around them, and then it will fly off with the female, they'll mate in flight, and then it pops the female down onto a flower for a drink, and then she takes her fill of nectar, goes back down the stem, and burrows into the ground again, and the whole life cycle appears. So it occurs. So it means that the life cycle of the female is coordinated with the appearance of the male wasp. But also the orchid that God made fits into this, because what the orchid does is it mimics the female. So that's the warty hammer orchid. You can see the head, same colour of the female. But this time the male comes down, grabs hold of it, and you can see the elbow there. So it almost sort of moves on a pivot. When the male actually grabs hold of it, instead of being able to fly freely away, it grabs hold of it, and then as it flies away, it crashes into the back of the orchid itself. Now, it will have visited other plants, and you're aware, particularly if you've got hay fever, that some plants have free pollen, wind-blown pollen, so they produce masses of pollen, and it's a more random pollination. But it's very specific. They have 2 packets of pollen called pollinia. There's a stick to the back of the wasp as it goes from flower to flower, and they are then transferred from one flower to the next. And it's not as precise as it looks. So a male may have several packets of pollen on its back, and typical male, it takes several times for it to try and fly away before it suddenly realizes it's been duped. You know how we are. So it will be going backwards and forwards, and each time pollination will take place. So God has coordinated the flowering of the orchid with the life cycle of the insect, and the female, coming to the top of a grass stem. And about 6% of plants throughout the world are pollinated by sexual mimicry, like the bee orchid, for example, where the flower mimics a female and the male comes in to mate. But what an extraordinary complex system that God has created. And to look at that and to wonder and to know about it is a real privilege, because you go, and the Lord God made it. How incredible. What about this one? Diascias. They were quite common as garden plants a while ago, still grown. Not all of them are winter hardy. But scientists wanted to know how they were pollinated. So, what better than to sort of pull up a chair, take a flask of tea and your sandwiches, and just go and sit and watch the flower to see what turned up. And they were amazed to see that on this landing lip, which again, you can see the design of the flower is perfect for. It is, by the way, so lovely to talk to people who believe in creation about this, because I do this as a work talk, and of course I can't. I use the word design. It's as my way of sort of getting in. That there is a great designer, but it's lovely to talk to people who go, "Oh, look at this! This is fantastic." God made this, and so He made a landing lip for the insect. And the insects that they found, this bee of a rediviva species, has very long legs, so it lands on here. There's enough room for it to do so. Pushes its front legs down into the spurs at the back, and it's got hairy legs, and the hairs point forward. So as the legs go down into those spurs at the back, they slice open little oil cells, which also are very contain sugar. So when they retract their legs, the liquid, the oil, is trapped in those hairs. Also, at the same time, the length of the leg fits the length of the spur. So they end up sitting with their head sort of right in the center there. Pollination takes place because is moved to the under part of the flower, and they collect pollen from the top. So it's very precise, sort of fitting in, almost like a piece of engineering, where the legs fit perfectly, and there it is with its sort of long legs and with you can see the hairs on the legs there, and then the pollen, which is then collected at the back of the flower. You can see that it has an oily nature. So it's like really, really precise. The insect fits the plant, and unless they, were made together, pollination wouldn't have taken place, and the species wouldn't have continued. So the bee wouldn't have received its pollen, and the plant wouldn't have been pollinated. So I've dropped in one or two pictures because the artwork, what we had to do, I've never done this before, but I had to write the words, and and then they said, "Oh, so what are you going to do about the pictures, Matt?" And I said, "Oh, I've never done the pictures before. What am I supposed to do?" And they said, "Oh, it's in your contract," which it wasn't when I looked, but it's in your contract for you to find images for the artist to draw. So they said, we need these urgently because we've got to crack on with them. There's a lot of them. Do you know a botanist? I thought, I don't want a botanist, fiddling around. This is my baby. Get very possessive about these things. You put lots of effort into it. So my daughter Chloe had done A-level photography, and I said, could I employ my daughter Chloe? Because you know what the kids are like these days. They know their way around the internet. And I will specify the images that I want. So, we need a wide shot, we need a close-up shot, we need a flower shot so that the artist has got everything that she needs. So Chloe and I had like a really, really frantic 4 days trying to, get all these images together.
I hope you paid her well, Matthew.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I hope you paid her well.
Yeah, it is. No, well, she gets paid. She lives here.
Apologies, I heckle.
We did pay her. And I don't know whether you would say pay her well, but but it was great to have somebody to work with, but also a great opportunity, actually, Gary, to sort of introduce her to the wonders of creation. You can do that sort of in, your preaching doesn't have to be, standing there thumping a Bible. You can just, I've realised this recently, because I've spent quite a bit of time in hospital. You can just mention it. I've mentioned to people, I've got this, I've got that, and I've got a faith. I've got a faith, and my faith is really, is really helping me through. And and then if people want to follow it up, or you can drop it in again. So there's lovely, gentle ways of preaching. So I hope Chloe noticed after all that. I was expected to write a little bit about the different habitats. So I wrote them and quite often sent them to experts, like some of my friends, to say, can you just check that this is right? Because then it's the most important book I've ever written. And we were able to include the Queen of the Andes, which is the most extraordinary thing, because what God has done is that you can see the alpacas. So the alpacas, and all the fauna is correct in the book as well. So we went all the bats and the birds and the bees and the moths and everything, the lizards, they're all correct for the habitat I wanted to make. And a lot of the stuff came from scientific papers, amazingly. But anyway, there it is in the wild. So the flower spike gets to be about 7 meters tall. The basal rosette, that big clump, gets to be about 3 by 4 meters across. And they can take up to 150 years to flower. And interestingly, these are at sort of high altitude, 3,500, 4,000 meters, where normally the plants would hunker down and be very, very small. But the way God makes it, he goes, I feel as though it sort of also shows his power and his sense of humor. He goes, I tell you what, I'm the Lord. I'm going to do something that's goes against the grain and all the logic and everything that I've put around it, just to prove that I can do it. Do you see what I mean? So I love things like this, the exceptions to the rule, because it's just God reinforcing, look, I can do this as well. There's nothing I can't do. So you've got this whacking great plant, and there's the man for scale. Now it produces about 4,000 flowers on it, and the flowers are very nectar rich, and it's bird pollinated mainly by the giant hummingbird, which incidentally spends a lot of its life in the lowlands. But when they occasionally flower, they instinctively, in inverted commas, know to go up high up into the mountains. They need about 3,500 calories an hour to stay flying. They're about the size of a starling, so it's big for a hummingbird. With So lots and lots of calories within that sugary sap, and they get pollinated. Sometimes the flower spikes get struck by lightning, and that's why here you can see that they are black. So they'll get struck by lightning. And though I wasn't able to verify this, somebody did say to me that they can see populations of them from the moon, from satellites, sorry. But I tried NASA and everywhere and couldn't find a satellite picture. So if you ever find a satellite picture of Puya Raymondii, the Queen of the Andes, then do let me know, because I'll be thrilled to bits to have that confirmed. So,
Matthew, when that flowers, does it die or does it?
Absolutely, wouldn't you? Yeah,
I don't know.
It does. Yeah, it does.
Yeah, okay.
It does. It puts all its energy. You're absolutely right. All its energy goes into that, and then it sort of collapses and dies, but produces lots of seeds and also some offsets as well at the base. But the problem is they're all on clustered together on mountaintops, so they're almost like on little islands around the Andes. And what they're finding is that through loss of habitat and through sort of genetic erosion, because they're not exchanging genes between populations, it's becoming an endangered species. But I'd love to see that in the wild. So there it is. There is one being pollinated, and all the energy has gone into that great flower spike, starting at the bottom and finishing flowering right at the top. And if you hop over to the Himalayas, there is something similar, which is extraordinary. So this only reaches about, I say only reaches 2 meters tall, with a root system that goes about 2 meters into the very rocky ground. And the roots spread out into the rocky ground so that when the water percolates through, when it does rain, that they've got lots of drinking straws to drink up through these fibrous roots. And this is, as you might have guessed by looking at the leaves, a kind of rhubarb, Rheum nobile, it's called. Now, what's interesting about this is that the Lord has, obviously, it's at high altitude, so it's given it a little greenhouse for the flowers to grow in. It also protects them, not just from the cold and the wind and the rain, but it protects the flowers from the UV light, which is very intense at altitude, and it would scorch them. And the fragrance from the flower attracts one kind of gnat, and the gnat is attracted to it, can crawl under the windows of the greenhouse, it can get in there, and it lays its eggs. But it doesn't lay so many eggs that all the flowers get eaten and no seeds are produced. So it lays enough eggs to keep the population going, but also, as you can see from the mass of flowers here, there are plenty spare. And then these bracts, so it's a little bit like the brown bit on the back of a daffodil, actually shrivel up and allow the seed to be dispersed. And there is a picture of one, and you can see the rocky soil that it lives in. I've found them in nurseries in the UK. I'm sort of half tempted to have a go at growing it. I don't know whether they would, how I could deceive them into thinking that Hertfordshire was the Himalayas, but, I might do that one day just to give it a go, give it some really rocky soil. You'd be better off if you were in Scotland, I think, having a go at growing that. But you can see how these are dotted around. And again, it's just like to me saying, look, the Almighty going, look, I can put some plants here as well that go against the grain, don't hunker down like most alpines do against the weather, but just will stand up there, and I'll cover them with a little greenhouse to protect them. And there is a species of gnat that will pollinate. It's all so precise, and it's just fantastic to see. And there was a botanist called Joseph Hooker, who was a director of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, and he went out to the Sikkim Himalayas. And he was a very good draftsman. So in those days, of course, you couldn't take photographs. So he would sketch and draw, and they were finished off by another brilliant man called Walter Hood Fitch. So there's his sort of image of an adult that he saw. There's some growing on the rocky hillsides, and that's what they look like. And if your rhubarb's ever flowered, you'll know that that's what the flowers, you get white flowers, and then the seeds that follow. And I've just put these in because I think the drawings are fantastic. They really are amazing for their detail and the patience and the skill required, again, for people to create art. Oh, it's that word creation again. But of course, people don't believe in God, do they? They don't believe in creation. And even though they use the word creativity. Popped in here the Mediterranean woodlands, because the Mediterranean woodlands provide us with cork oak. When it was realised that cork was a useful commodity, then cork oak was planted, and it's a habitat now to lots of rare and endangered species, including the Iberian lynx. And Chloe found a photograph of an Iberian lynx with two little cubs, actually in some cork oak. And so we were able to send that across. And I did ask specifically that should go in, if that was okay. And we've got the black-winged storks that nest there as well. You can see that the cork oak is peeled off, and it's the only tree where you can take the bark from it and it will regrow. And it takes 25 years before they can peel the bark off safely, and then they regrow for about 9, 10, up to 15 years before they harvest again. Guinness Book of Records revealed that the largest one, which is called the Whistler tree because of the number of birds in there, still grows. And you'll find Quercus suber in UK gardens and some of the big gardens. And I don't know if you can see this on the right-hand side, but we did a little list of things that the Romans used the cork for beehives because it stays cool. The temperature is maintained and balanced. The Greeks used it for floats. They use it to fill car seats. And it is been used in the nose cone of the space shuttle, and that's cork, and it has great insulating qualities. It is possible to buy cork handbags, I noticed, and bags. I'd love to carry a haversack made out of cork. That would be really cool. But it just goes to show that this material, when there's some lovely, no words in the Bible are ever throwaway. They're all relevant, but the way it's almost, I wouldn't say brushed over, but it just said God made herb for the service of man, and that's it. And it doesn't reveal all the food that we eat, the medicines, our clothes, our timber. So much goes back to plants. It all goes back to plants. The air we breathe out the CO2. The trees breathe it in, then they breathe out the oxygen. So the trees and the vegetation are very much for the service of man. And it's gloriously understated. That's all you can say when God made her for the service of man. Now, it's not just insects, but bats are quite often part of pollination. And I had the privilege of interviewing a bat lady. I don't know if any of you listened to Gardener's Question Time, but a couple of weeks ago, I was able to interview a bat lady. And we did go to Battersea Park, inevitably. But the aircraft were too noisy, so we had to make a move. But often with bat-pollinated plants, which happens a lot in the tropics, you'll find they hang on these great candelabras, so the bats can navigate their way through. And if you ever see bats in the garden or go for a walk in the parks in Shrewsbury and see the bats, you can see how agile they are. They're phenomenal. You think swifts and swallows are amazing, but when you see a bat darting around in the twilight, using its echolocation, you think, wow, that is incredible. Anyway, on this flower, oh golly, and its name has escaped me, and so hopefully it will come back. It's something Haltermai, Mucuna haltermai. So it's from Central America and also in parts of northern South America. And the echolocation works this way. The bats send out their sound. When the flower has not been pollinated, it bounces back. It goes to them. They go in, they take the pollen. But once they've done that, then the flower very quickly changes shape because obviously there's no point in another visit. Job done. And so the Lord makes them change shape. They deteriorate quickly, and the bats go around and pollinate the flowers. And you can see them going, let's say, in between these long sort of dangly chandeliers. Some of the bats also have really long tongues to take the nectar from the bottom of the flower. That's their energy source. So for, in return for pollination, you can see there that the pollen will be being dusted onto its head. You can just about see that there. This bat dips its long tongue in there and gets a drink of nectar to enable it to go to another flower. But this is my favorite one. This one looks as though it's a party all night. This is a tree from Cuba, the blue Tahoe, which is kind of hibiscus. And this one, it's like staggering home, to get stopped by the police on the way for being drunk and disorderly, absolutely covered in pollen. And a lot of the bat pollinated plants really go big time into this. If anybody ever offers you a cutting of Epiphyllum oxypetalum, which is a lovely white night flowering cactus, then for goodness sake, take it, because when it flowers, it will send its fragrance through pretty much the whole of the house. When the one I had flowered, Jill, my wife and I just pulled up a chair and sat and watched and just looked at it because it was amazing and the fragrance was incredible. So there's often quite a strong fragrance with night flowering plants as well. In Mauritius, lizards do the job, and this is called Rousseauia simplex. There's some very interesting plants live on islands, and this is interesting from the fact that it's an endangered species through human activity, is the plant, Rousseauia simplex. And it's the only one that we know of where the Mauritian day gecko is responsible for pollination and also seed distribution. So normally the insects will pollinate, the birds, as we see now, will eat the polyfruit and distribute the seeds. But on this occasion, you've got the lizard taking the nectar from it. Once the pollination has taken place and the fruits are formed, they nibble the top off there, and it's like strawberry jam inside. So they eat strawberry jam, passes through their gut, and they deposit it, and then the populations gradually get bigger and bigger. So this was down to 6 plants when it was discovered. So they took propagation material, and bulked them up, and now they're growing them in situ, and this day gecko is still helping with the pollination. It's an interesting plant because it doesn't really know whether it should be a shrub or a liana. It's having a bit of an identity crisis. Sometimes they find it as shrubby, and then you'll find a huge stem going off somewhere, deciding to wander off. But again, it's all the way God made it, just really interesting and really fascinating. One of the things I was blessed to find was I wanted somebody to be a botanical checker because there's a lot of facts in here, and I was very nervous about the volume of facts, and I wanted to find out about a particular eucalyptus that's in the book. And on another book I'd worked on, somebody mentioned Professor Kingsley Dixon at a university in Australia. So I asked him about the number of eucalypts of this particular kind. And he was really kind. He responded like really quickly, and I was amazed. And I did find that if you say, hi, my name's Matt, I'm writing a children's book, people suddenly go, and again, I think that was, to me, that was the Lord helping me by giving me people to help me. You see what I mean? His hand was there all the time. I could see it working all the time. It was fabulous. He really helped. This is God's book about God's plants, and I was just privileged to be the person who, tapped it out on the keyboard or was, given the contact. Anyway, this guy ended up, this professor ended up saying, I'll be your botanical checker. And I said, I can't pay you. I don't have a budget. And he went, no, don't worry about it. So that was a real burden lifted, and he just did little tweaks like this. So it used to have a European name, but now they've gone to Kwongan, which is the Aboriginal name of this savanna grassland. And it was those kind of little details that needed to be right. They had, when you publish something, the evidence is there to be held up against you. And I felt, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I felt the Lord was watching my back, and making sure things didn't go wrong. Anyway, so just quickly go to the Western Australian Christmas tree, which is a fabulous plant. It's a parasite, believe it or not, and parasitizes about 150 different species of grasses and shrubs. And it will produce its own energy from the sunlight because it's got its leaves. And then around about Christmas time, has these bright orange flowers. Noitsia floribunda. If you Google it, the color is just extraordinary. But what it does is it sends out its roots, and then from these roots, you get almost like a little pair of scissors. So they wrap around the roots of another plant and snip effectively with blades, cut into the roots and draw the nutrients from the plants. And in the 50s, the Americans were launching a series of satellites, and they put one of their satellite stations, one of their tracking stations, in the middle of Australia. So they built the tracking station, put all the kit in there, and then suddenly they had problems with the electricity. Fuses would be going, lights in certain areas of the compound would be going out. So they checked all the fuses, they checked all the wiring, they did everything. And then in the end, and I've not yet been able to find out exactly how through this process of elimination they worked it. There's a lot of articles, but nobody gives you the detail. But somebody thought, well, perhaps we ought to sort of dig up the cables that are coming into the compound to see if there's anything there. And what they did was they dug up the cables, and lo and behold, this tree had thought that it was the roots of another tree that it could parasitize, and actually had cut through armored cable. So it had scissored its way through the armored cable, thinking it was going to get a free meal, but instead shorted all the lights and all the circuits in the system, which I think is a great story. Is the power of the plant. Obviously a case of mistaken identity. But what a great story. The tree, the tree should think, oh yes, here's a nice meal, nice free meal. I'll cut my way through, and then lo and behold, it wasn't. So life is not always what we think it will be. And I was also given by the Lord this plant in a journal that I get. And there was something about it in the paper, actually. That's right, something about it in the paper. And then I got the details from a journal. It appeared in the next month. Well, that doesn't happen by chance. That's given to you by the Lord to help me, help me with my work. So it's a vine from the temperate rainforests of Chile. And it has the ability to change its leaves according to the plant that it's growing through. So it sort of like can camouflage itself. So if it's got a pointy leaf, the leaves on the plant, on this boquilla it's called, will change size, shape, leaf pattern as it climbs through. And the scientists have found that it can change into 12 different kinds of plants to camouflage itself, which is most extraordinary. And the best bit for me is that the scientists aren't really sure how it does it. How can it tell? How can it mimic effectively the plant that it's going through? So how can a rounded leaf suddenly appear, and then a lobed leaf, and then a pointed leaf? And it's those kind of things that you go, yeah, the Lord's thrown that in just to confuse everyone, and to prove yet again that He's magnificent and all powerful, and there are things that we just do not know and cannot be explained. Here's another this is an orchid that was found in the 50s. It's a shrub here, and it's called the honey myrtle. And in the 50s, a farmer was rootling around in his garden and noticed a cloud of gnats above the soil, and then looked a bit closer and saw this, dug around it, and revealed an underground orchid that doesn't photosynthesize, so it lives underground, taps into using fungi into the roots of the honey myrtle, and within each little flower group, there's about 150 little flowers, and they are gnat pollinated. So you've effectively got an orchid that flowers underground and steals food from another plant. And nobody really knows how many of these there are, how many populations, obviously, because they're all hidden. But there are now 7 different species that they've identified of this plant, so several different kinds of this hidden underground orchid. And then you go to the tropics, where there's always amazing things going on. I don't know if you've ever had the chance to go to the tropics, but the rainforests are extraordinary. And the Titanarum, which you'll see in botanical gardens, this is at Kew, is the most amazing of them all. What actually happens when it's pollinated is that it smells really, really bad. And the Titanarum, they've analysed some of the chemicals in there, and 2 of the major sort of active chemicals are one that smells like rotting fish and the other like sweaty socks. So you've got to no wonder it's called the corpse lily, and it attracts carrion flies. But what actually happens is that they bring the pollen in from another plant, and when they go into the female, so when the female part of the flower is ready, the male isn't, so they can walk over that without taking any pollen from it. They pollinate using the pollen that they brought from another plant. The flower then collapses, with pollination takes place. Then the male, the pollen is released. So it matures about 48 hours after the females. And then the insects crawl out, collect their next batch of pollen, and move on to another plant. And with the Giantarum, the temperature in the centre there gets to be about 5-10 degrees higher than the surroundings in the tropics in Borneo, where it is, Sumatra and Borneo, so that the odour evaporates, it vaporizes and goes higher up into the rainforest where there's more air movement, and the insects can smell it, they say, up to 5 kilometres away. And it turns up, as I say, in botanical gardens. When it first turned up at Kew, the police were called. In Victorian times, this was because there was such a big queue that they needed crowd control. And even now, it still gets on the telly. And so it builds itself up. So you'll have several years of a tree-like structure while it fills the big tuber down below with energy. Then it will produce the flower and then the fruit. And the fruit are stacked according to and I'm not a mathematician, but it's the Fibonacci series, which gives us the golden ratio and the perfect proportion. So they are packed in the most efficient mathematical way, just to remind us that God made it all. And out in the Amazon, and I've had the privilege of seeing these, is the giant water lily. Until last July, it was Victoria Amazonica. And then just in time, and again, I think the Lord was helping me here, they discovered new specimens in the herbarium at Kew and decided that Victoria boliviana was the name of the new species. It had more spines on this part of the flower, so they actually named it as a new species just in time. Otherwise, the book would have been published with an erroneous name and would have been obsolete before it shelves. It's a dodgy business, this publishing lark, particularly with something like this. But I believe the Lord helped me. It's just the timing was extraordinary. If it had been, I don't know, 3 weeks later, then they wouldn't have been able to do anything. Anyway, there it is in the Amazon. You may have seen this on Green Planet, these huge leaves that inspired Joseph Paxton to create his glass houses. They start off rolled up, covered in spines to push everything out of the way and to make sure that they're not eaten. And you could almost see them grow. They'll grow about sort of half a metre a day and they grow them as an annual at Kew. And when I used to take groups around Kew, I'd look at it in the morning, go, right, okay, that's how it is. And then see what it was like at 3 o'clock when I came again. And you could see that it had actually grown. It was magnificent. And you've got this very flat plate-like leaf, and you'd think that it would sink as it's in the rainforest, but there are little micropores over the surface so that the water drains away, and there are V-shaped notches cut in the side of the leaves so they will drain. And that's the underside of the leaf I saw towards the end of the season. But you've got this rib structure supporting. So it does mean that when people sort of flick coins on them, they will go through. But if you spread the weight around, they can support quite a weight, because all of these rib structures are full of buoyancy bags, if you like. They flower in the evening. Fragrance is wonderful. It's like a pineapple version of Pantro, extraordinary. It's pollinated by these scarab beetles who can smell the fragrance and also see the flower. Now, it's all about temperatures, 32 degrees C, the temperature at which they function most efficiently. So they go to the flower and they go towards the warmth. So it's 32 degrees C in here. And you'll get a lot of them in there. So they'll all go in there bringing pollen from other plants. Once pollination has taken place, that's where the pollen is received. They'll be munching away at the side here. So again, having a party in there, plenty to eat. That's the reward. Pollination takes place. Then the flower changes colour. No point in others coming to visit, is there again? And the temperature here cools. But it then gets to be about 32 degrees here, where the pollen is ripening. So the message goes around to the beetles, hey, tell you what, it's warmer up there. It's 32 degrees C, just the temperature we like. So they all start crawling their way out. The flower then collapses, provides them with their sort of takeoff ramps, and away they fly. And isn't that fantastic? Absolutely fantastic. So precise and a wonderful, wonderful plant. And talking of going against the grain, here's some vegan carnivorous plants. Not all carnivorous plants are carnivorous. This one survives from the rotting leaves that Nepenthes amphorea is called, because it looks like a jar, and they live on the rotting leaves that fall from above. And also there is a species of frog, very, very tiny, about 3 millimeters long, that can survive in there and has special claws on its pads, so it can crawl up the sides and when it needs to get out. Now, if you have a children's book, you've got to have poo in it. So in went this one, Nepenthes raja, which is the largest of the Nepenthes, the monkey cups, holds about 2 litres. And scientists quite recently discovered that it's fertilised by 2 kinds of a rat and a shrew, a mountain rat at night and a shrew during the day. And what actually happens is that there is nectar produced on the lid, on the toilet seat, if you like. So they sit there, they go to the toilet, so they're fertilizing the plant. They receive their reward of nectar. The geometry in the scientific paper that I found, all sorts of measurements, the geometry is perfect to fit the rat and the shrew. So it's not too wide, not too narrow, perfect to fit. Occasionally they do find bodies of small ones in there, and it was originally thought that it did trap rats to survive, but that, they're the babies that didn't quite make it, fell off the toilet seat, as it were, and into the toilet. But that's how that is pollinated. So it's just like, putting chicken fertilizer on your garden. They poo into this liquid, it becomes a liquid fertilizer, which the plant then absorbs. And because it's an area of high rainfall, obviously they need to make sure, up in the cloud forests, that it's they get their nutrients. And there, just to prove it, it's a photograph of one in real life, one of the tree shrews on the toilet with its feet there and its paws just perfectly situated. And I did read that there is actually in the sugary substance a laxative, just to make sure that it gets what it came for. So there you go. It all works. So some of the plants are in the book, some of them aren't, and this one isn't. It's one of my favourites. We sort of conclude really with this one, saying, the Lord God made them all and absolutely fantastic. And the more that we see and know about creation, the more we should give God the glory. And it does make us look forward. It's so sad, the ecological destruction. I've had a friend who's just been to the Amazon rainforest and says, the burning of the rainforest for short-term gain, environmental destruction, we're poisoning the water we drink, the air that we breathe. Unless Jesus comes back, the world doesn't stand a chance. And yet around us is all this witness of the wonderful things that he's done that people can see on the telly and, visit for themselves if they're very fortunate. And it just says to us, though, as Christadelphians, praise be to the Lord, and how wonderful he is and how remarkable his power. And this is the carnauba wax palm from the savannas of Brazil. And they harvest the young leaves, scrape off the wax. You can see it's very waxy because the water is on there. They scrape off the wax. They use it in lipsticks, in tablets. I found it in car polishes. You'll see carnauba wax written on the back. But to me, it's the most important because it's the wax that puts the glaze on Smarties. And Smarties themselves, of course, are made of chocolate, which is another, plant that God gave for the service of man. So at the end of the day, the creation around us in the world of plants, and the message I was able to deliver through this book to the children and anybody else who is prepared to listen is really, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised. Thank you.